of 10 kgs in 4 months, joint pain, which had recurred again since 2 months, and exertional dyspnea, NYHA class 2. So, as you can see, this is his the presentation that he came to us with, and also with the on the tongue you can see the indentations of the teeth. For the above complaints, he initially went to another center where he underwent biochemical and radiological investigations. His USG neck showed bilateral submandibular lymphadenopathy, and FNAC was done, which was inconclusive. Here you can see the CT scan that was also done over there, which showed just diffuse enlargement of the tongue without any enhancing lesions. So the tongue was diffusely bulky with no enhancing lesion, and there was multiple soft tissue calcifications involving the soft tissue and floor of the mouth. He required further evaluation for a primary metabolic etiology. So consequently, then the blood tests were done, which showed prior to admission, which showed anemia, which was HB was 9.8, it was normocytic normochromic. The other investigations were done. His LFTs were fine. His TSH was 4.7. His urine routine showed proteins 3+ with absent RBCs and a granular cast. His ionized calcium was 1.64 millimoles per liter.
Neil, can you give people a chance to give a thought on the basis of information provided so far? Would audience want to make some comment from the information provided so far?
Macroglossia with proteinuria, we should rule out amyloidosis.
Amyloidosis or even some infiltrative disease at this age, lymphoproliferative disorders.
Or monoclonal gammopathy with amyloid.
That will come as AL amyloid.
Yeah, that will be along the path.
Because there is joint pains.
The only thing which comes with macroglossia in nephrology is AL amyloid.
So I'll continue.
Yep.
Any comments from other members? Okay, Neil, go ahead.
Yes, sir. So he was referred to us in view of his hypercalcemia and proteinuria. On admission, the patient was hemodynamically stable. His blood pressure was 130/80 in the supine position, and the standing position was 100/70. He had edema over his lower limbs. He also complained of joint pain. This is his macroglossia. Here, this joint. Here, he also complained of pain in the wrists and also in the proximal metapharyngeal joints, and he had edema over his lower limbs. The labs on admission. So here also his creatinine was 1.1. His CBC showed anemia. His calcium was 12.4 mg per deciliter, and his corrected calcium was 12.98. The urine routine showed proteins 1+, RBCs absent. His UPCR was 3.26, and his 24-hour urinary protein was 1 gram per day. In view of his hypercalcemia, we sent the following investigations. His PTH, which came out to be 3.9. His vitamin D was 39. His 125 dihydroxyvitamin D was normal. To evaluate a monoclonal gammopathy, we sent his serum protein electrophoresis, immunofixation, and a free light chain assay, and consequently initiated him on treatment with hydration, diuretics, and calcitonin. With further, a USG was done, which showed hepatosplenomegaly, normal sized kidneys with increased echogenicity with maintained CMD. In view of his ischemic heart disease, we have done a 2D echo, which showed an EF of 40% and type 1 diastolic dysfunction. Consequently, after the initiation of therapy, his calcium showed a downward trend, and then by the 21st, his serum calcium was in the normal range, and then so consequently, the therapy with calcitonin and diuretics was gradually stopped. Here we see the SPEP report. In the SPEP report, however, we did not see an M band. The comment was a distorted gamma region, and further immunofixation result was awaited. Consequently, the immunofixation picked up a band in the lambda region, and the free light chain assay showed a lambda proliferation, which was 1450 and a ratio of kappa to lambda of 0.01. He had normal kidney function. His creatinine was normal. So here we would like to highlight that, in fact, despite the fact the SPEP was negative, the immunofixation was positive. SPEP being a modality which sort of assesses the M protein based on charge and mass, can miss light chains because of their mass is less as compared to the heavy chains. Also, if the light chains, if kidney function is normal, there will be excreted in the urine, so it may not be picked up on an SPEP. So if we combine an SPEP with an immunofixation, and also we do a SPEP with a free light chain assay, the sensitivity increases significantly to 94% in amyloid and almost 100% in 100% in myeloma. Thus, while evaluating a case of suspected monoclonal gammopathy, it is better to screen with SPEP and free light chain assay rather than only using SPEP. So the issues with our patient were macroglossia, proteinuria, band in the lambda region on immunofixation, hypercalcemia, organomegaly, ischemic heart disease, and a history of arthropathy with joint deformity. So the provisional diagnosis was multiple myeloma with amyloidosis in view of the macroglossia and multi-system involvement. A bone marrow aspiration and biopsy was done. An abdominal fat biopsy was done, and a PET CT scan was also done. The bone marrow revealed, as you can see, presence of plasma cells with the intensely basophilic cytoplasm and the eccentric nucleus at the periphery, which shows. So the plasma cells were around 25% in the marrow. There was a normal erythroid, myeloid, and megakaryocytic differentiation, and the CD138 was positive on immunohistochemistry with lambda overexpression. The abdominal fat biopsy showed areas of hemorrhage, and there were areas of pink acellular deposits. The Congo-Red stain was positive with apple green birefringence under polarized microscope. The PET CT showed a lytic lesion at L2 with hepatosplenomegaly with mild ascites with lymphadenopathy. Thus, our final diagnosis was a lambda light chain multiple myeloma, AL amyloidosis with involvement of the tongue, and we suspect the other organs, also the kidney, leading to the proteinuria, hepatosplenomegaly, his postural hypertension, and his arthropathy could also be attributed to this systemic disease, and hypercalcemia. For the above, the transplant team felt that in view of his advanced age and his poor Karnofsky score, he could not be offered a transplant. So he was initiated on bortezomib, lenalidomide, and dexamethasone. After the second dose of bortezomib, he developed fever and abdominal distension. He was consequently shifted to the ICU and managed conservatively. He was stabilized and shifted back to the ward. Patient at present is on the VRD regimen, receiving bortezomib once a week. He's on lenalidomide 25 mg for 21 days and dexamethasone 20 mg. He has completed 10 cycles. Currently, he is maintained on this regimen. He's now, the tongue swelling has decreased slightly, and he's able to now have semi-solid food. His dysarthria also has decreased significantly. The plan is to continue him on the BRD regimen for 12 cycles and then place him on lenalidomide maintenance. As you can see, the lambda levels have fallen to below 100, and they have been done repeatedly. His last level was 50 mg per liter. His UPCR is 1.5. His kidney function is still remained normal, and his serum calcium is also in the normal range. Just a few slides on macroglossia. Macroglossia is a true enlargement of the tongue. The common causes being amyloid, hypothyroidism, acromegaly, and an infiltrative disorder. Lymphangioma also has to be ruled out. In amyloidosis, it is the most frequent oral manifestation of amyloid and seen in 10 to 20% of amyloidosis. The most common amyloid condition associated with it is AL amyloid. But before this, other conditions such as hypothyroidism, malignancy, and deficiency of vitamin B12 should also be ruled out. The clinical manifestations are speech impairment, swallowing problems, breathing difficulties, and life-threatening complications such as airway obstruction. The management of amyloidosis is basically you reduce the supply of the precursor proteins, so you put him on bortezomib therapy and managing the disability. So managing the disability is primarily a surgical management or a conservative management. If the amyloidosis is a systemic involvement due to AL amyloid, surgical management is generally not recommended because there is a high chance of recurrence, and also there is greater chances of bleeding during operation. So if it is a localized amyloid, then you can do a localized glossectomy. However, if there is a diffuse AL amyloid, then they do consider a tracheostomy like a conservative management in the form of a tracheostomy, a gastrostomy if needed, and rarely surgical debulking has been tried. Rarely radiotherapy also has been tried. However, they are not yet recommended. Thank you.
Hello.
Sunil, stop sharing your screen and people can. The floor is open for discussion.
Last year in MNG meeting, we had presented 2 cases like this, similar, with joint pains and pre-light chain monoclonal gammopathy. And they had a remarkable improvement with the treatment. So joint pains, we should think of monoclonal gammopathy.
What is surprising, I find, is that there's no renal involvement. Usually, it is the commonest one which they manifest. Our last time case was RPGN presentation and turned out to be Waldenstone microglobulinemia.
I had similar patient last year, and we had done the kidney biopsy which showed amyloid fibrils on electroscopy. And after cycles of bortezomib, we had done the bone marrow transplant, and patient is doing very well with the minimum requirement of lenalidomide and steroids following bone marrow transplant. So I think you should have done a kidney biopsy to show the presence of amyloid fibrils just to complete the whole investigation. The important thing here is it is a lambda light chain disease. So on serum total proteins, you will never see proteins of 7 or 8 grams. Proteins will be still 5.5 grams, the total proteins. The important thing is that all adults with proteinuria, if they don't have history of diabetes or hypertension, you must do serum-free light chains where it will always pick up lambda light chain. AL amyloid is a manifestation of lambda light chain. So unless you do free light chain assays, you will miss the diagnosis.
Here, I think the diagnosis was made, the main presentation was macroglossia with this joint pain.
That's fine. Here there were macroglossia, but if there is no macroglossia, and the presentation is only proteinuria with lower side blood pressure, if you don't do free light chain assays, you will miss the whole diagnosis only because the lambda light chain doesn't produce high total proteins.
So with every middle-aged or elderly person coming with these kinds of symptoms, a serum protein electrophoresis with a free light chain assay would essentially give us the diagnosis. All students in the group, for every patient presenting with these symptoms, we should remember that sometimes serum protein electrophoresis may come negative, but the free light chain assay along with the serum protein electrophoresis will give you a 100% sensitive report.
And you can, if these things recover, you can always go for a bone marrow transplant now if the patient can afford, so that it will prevent further kidney injury.
Our patient was deemed unfit by the hematology team for various reasons, and hence we couldn't send the patient up for a bone marrow transplant. So he was treated with all the chemotherapy agents which were available, including bortezomib. Presently doing.
Interesting fact is to see the kidney pathology, what actually has happened. So
And he
biopsy.
was on clopidogrel, sir, and he had issue of bleeding also.
Can stop it. if
That's why
it's
we
five
had done
days.
only an abdominal biopsy. Did not do the kidney.
You got biopsy
Renal
positive.
function is good and we have reasonably taken care of the disease. Doing an invasive procedure at this point of time where we have the diagnosis and we are managing, how would it change what we are doing?
No, this is to complete any MGRS. This is like MGRS without classical presentation of myeloma. Here, no doubt the plasma cells are 25%. The presentation is more like myelometastasis, but it is worth for our completion of the whole case and then subsequently deciding about the bone marrow transplant. It's a
But
great.
when you have sufficient information from other investigations, why do an invasive procedure when it is not going to alter your plan of treatment? So, if it is not going to alter plan of treatment, it would not be worth doing an invasive.
Suppose if your bone marrow had not shown plasma cells of 25%, and if it was only 4-5%, then you would be stuck. What do you do next?
So we are not talking
And you have
about
to do
situation. We already have a diagnosis here.
I also would agree with Dr. Shah that I would also go ahead with the biopsy because another major organ which is going to give him problem is kidney. So whether it is just there is no involvement, but there would be amyloid deposits in the kidney also, most likely, because right.
There
So
will be.
I would like to have
That would not change your plan of treatment.
Yes, but I would at least know that the kidney involvement, it is how extensive is the amyloid there.
How
and
does it help? How does it help?
Yes, the
It
line
will
of
remain the
management, agree, it will not change, but I will have a basic level
If-
because it's
If
patient.
it is
Even abdominal.
if the involvement is gross with fibrils and other things, you will push this patient for bone marrow transplant for sure, because that will be a great preventive measure to have a further deterioration of kidney function in future.
But that also would not depend on what your biopsy shows. Your
Of course,
decision
if there is a kidney involvement, once your proteinuria things and come under control, your serum free light chains come under control with chemotherapy, after 6 cycles, you can very surely explain to the patient if you do the bone marrow transplant, your organ can be protected in future, kidney. And it is recommended that you do bone marrow
for
transplant.
that, again, you would not need a kidney biopsy. Decision about bone marrow transplant would be made by a hematologist.
Correct, but
All
all hematologists would ask you for a biopsy in a patient like this. Here you were lucky to get plasma cells of 25%. This L amyloid patient never
we
present.
are talking,
Then
we are
never
talking
present
of the
with
current case, no? We are not talking of a scenario where we do not find diagnosis on bone marrow. We have an established diagnosis. So, Kalpana, I would disagree with doing a biopsy for this patient.
Oh, was this beta to microglobulin of this patient? No,
How does that help?
no.
That
Just
will be high.
First principle.
Prognosis point of view.
there are many things which may not, but we need to prognosticate the patient. This is, of course, is the difference. I would do kidney biopsy not only to confirm the diagnosis, no need of confirming diagnosis because you already have multiple myeloma approved, already have amyloidosis approved. But as I said earlier, because the kidney being the major organ involved, I would like to do it both for the academic purpose and also for an baseline level to know this patient because it's a long protracted course this patient will have in long run.
What baseline level do you want?
I will tell you what happened to my patient.
No. In this case,
No, I will tell you.
1 minute. Tarun, I'm asking Kalpana, what do you want?
No, not in the kidney involvement. I have to have the kidney histology picture.
Generally,
Point from a
called a abdominal fat biopsy to avoid kidney biopsy.
Biopsy is positive.
Now I will tell you what happened in my patient. When we did the biopsy, there was FS, so FSCS and amyloid both in terms of like proteinuria does not absorb. Proteinuria continued to be 3 grams last 1 year. So now the question came after bone marrow transplant and maintenance therapy and steroids, do we add anything? And we had discussed with our hematologist, and they all of us have come to the conclusion if there is an in the kidney, cyclophosphamide would be the best drug to use. So now we have put the patient on cyclophosphamide after 1 year because patient had associated FSGS on kidney biopsy. So that you will know when you serially do your protein levels, proteinuria levels, and once you have a baseline kidney biopsy, you'll be able to monitor and take a decision on whether some other drugs are required for this patient or not.
So that you can do a biopsy if there is a poor response to
No
any-
regression, yes.
Supposing if you have a complete response, why should one be
And
subjected
but
to an
in
invasive
your
procedure?
complete response, what is your proteinuria level now, which you have not shown?
So we have to
What is
monitor proteinuria, not the biopsy.
Proteinuria has come to 1.28, sir.
Hey, in your case, you started with 1 gram proteinuria, it is still remained at 1.28 grams of proteinuria. So why the proteinuria is still there if there is a complete response?
That's fine. I mean, so long
No,
as
it's
you
fine. Complete response in myeloma is proteinuria of less than 500 milligram.
that is all theory. When it comes to
No.
practice,
If
we
you
have
have to add a treatment, if you have to take further course correction in this patient, you need to have a biopsy. If your proteinuria is not resolved, you cannot leave it at that.
I would be reluctant for a biopsy, and I
No,
think
I say in AL amyloid, the complications of biopsy are almost as much as native biopsies in other kidney diseases. There is no extra complications on
yeah,
doing
but
kidney.
after all, it's an invasive procedure which is not taking you anywhere
No,
further.
if your proteinuria is not resolved, you have not answered the question. What
Anyway,
is the
I think people may have a different opinion. We would not do a biopsy when it is not going to make a change in our line of treatment.
So on what basis you are saying the patient has responded only on free light chains? What about the kidney? Free light chains are only answering your hematological response. What about your proteinuria when it doesn't respond? Where are you answering your nephrologist point of view?
So I would observe what the proteinuria is. If the proteinuria is remaining in the region of 1 gram, if the renal function is stable, I would not do anything particularly more than what the hematologists are doing for his.
Your proteinuria has remained same. It was 1.08
So I
grams
wouldn't
on present.
do anything if it's stable.
And then it is not called complete response kidney-wise. It is only
I would like
response.
to say, Shruti, there was another same case which I talked about. The kidney biopsy was done, and we're not expecting anything more beyond than what you are discussing. But there were lymphocytic infiltration which was passed by the first histopathologist as normal. Now, we went ahead and did the histochemistry, and that turned out NHL. So, of course, it will not happen in all the cases. But I think there's a difference of opinion. Let us leave it at that.
So we had just thought that, okay, the whole case was worked up and it was only the kidney which we knew that it is going to be involved by this disease, and we are treating the disease. So we have taken that angle that we have done so much invasion in this patient, 1 kidney biopsy, the treatment remaining same. We thought 1 invasive procedure to be lessened. That is all what was the thinking, that if we are not going to change what we do, why do we do a procedure, was the way of thinking. Now I would like to invite Ishan, who would on the same lines, we have a rare case, a rare presentation of a not so common disorder. This is the second of the series. So Dr. Ishan, start your presentation.
Yes. Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. I'm presenting a case of 52-year-old man presenting with epistaxis. A 52-year-old male, known case of ischemic heart disease, he developed bleeding from the nose in February 2019. He went to an ENT surgeon who advised nasal packing and conservative management. His blood pressure was 130 by 90 millimeter mercury at that time. It was normotensive. In March 2019, he started complaining of breathlessness on exertion. He went to a cardiologist who did electrocardiogram, 2D echo, and X-ray chest, which were normal. He then went to a pulmonologist who advised CCT of chest, which showed findings of small airway disease. An incidental finding reported on that was collapse of C7 vertebrae. He was started on salbutamol, methadose inhaler, and Darifilin for his complaints. His complaints were still persistent in form of dyspnea, so he went to a general physician in April 2019 who advised blood test. His urine routine showed protein of +2, blood trace, RBC 224 plus high power fill, first cell 6 to 8. CBC showed hemoglobin of 12 grams, WBC count 7,000, platelet 269,000. Serum creatinine was normal, 0.82 milligram per deciliter, and urine albumin to creatinine ratio was 130 microgram per gram. The ultrasound abdomen showed bilateral normal sized kidneys with maintained CMD. In May 2019, he complained of sudden onset change in voice. He went to a neurologist and was diagnosed to have acute bulbar weakness and was given 3 doses of methylprednisolone 500 mg followed by tapering dose of deflazacort and tablet pyridostigmine 50 mg thrice a day. He continued same medications with partial relief of symptoms. He again had one episode of epistaxis. His creatinine was slightly high, 1.69 milligram per deciliter compared to previous value. In June 2019, he complained of burning micturition, no complaint of fever, hematuria, flank pain. Urine routine showed a protein 1 plus, first cells more than 200 per high power fill. So he was treated with injection amikacin 500 milligram 12 hourly for 7 days. During that period, he had 2 episodes of melena, so esophageal was done, which showed enteral gastritis. After 1 week of antibiotics, he repeated urine routine, which showed protein +4, RBC 022, first cells 223. UACR was 408 microgram per gram. His creatinine had increased to 12.6 milligram per deciliter. At this stage, he was referred to us. He had lost significant weight loss, 20 to 25 kilos over 5 months. He was hemodynamically stable. General and systemic examination was unremarkable. Routine blood and urine tests reveal urine routine showed.
You want to stop here and okay, you can show the next slide and then take an opinion from the audience.
Yes, sir. Urine routine showed protein of +2, first cells 8 to 10, and RBC 4 to 5 for high power fill. The CBC showed hemoglobin of 8.3 gram, anemic, total count 8,417, platelet count 281,000. Creatinine increased to 15.91 milligram, burn was 59. Potassium 5.7 and bicarbonate 17 milliequivalent. Calcium was normal 9.2, total protein 6 gram with albumin of 3.4 and globulin 2.6. Alkaline phosphatase was normal. Spot urine protein creatine ratio was 5.67. It has increased. And USG KUB showed bulky kidneys with increased cortical echogenicity and maintained CMD. There was no hydronephrosis or hydroureter C.
So any comment, any differential diagnosis that audience would like to put forward?
They gave a large dose of amikacin, right? His second creatinine was 1.69 and still he was given 1 gram of amikacin per day for UTI. Because I think by the end of 2018, The creatinine was 1.69, so that was quite odd, you know. And well, he has developed proteinuria. Azotemia is probably a side effect of amikacin. But since there has been, in all three reports, there has been some proteinuria which has increased now. You'll have to do the immunofixation studies and the biopsy. These are two things remaining.
What is the time period between epistaxis first time and the raised creatinine? In months or?
In months, man.
In months.
Yeah, it was February presented. In May, his creatinine has gone up to 1.69.
I think there are no students want to commit. Syndrome looks like more of an either first before the creatine was rising, there was proteinuria, which was quite significant. So nephrotic syndrome with secondary cause, particularly in this man with secondary causes, mainly malignancy or paranephrosis syndrome or RPGN. And RPGN, one must consider whether he has ANCA-associated vasculitis. This is what at this stage I would like to say. Anyone?
He had that collapse vertebra of D7. So you should always look out on the first CCT that's in a collapsed vertebra at D7. So you should rule out myeloma-like things in this patient. Any fracture in elderly patient with renal involvement, we have to rule out myelometastasis, you know.
Any comment? Any more comments? Any more comments? Shall we go ahead?
Yeah.
Okay. So that was a good pitch by Arun. And let's come to the case further.
So,
Okay.
so toxic ATN due to aminoglycoside toxicity, because his creatinine is already 1.69, he was given 1 gram per day of aminoglycoside. But you should also remember this creatinine was already high before we gave an amikacin. RPGN, as man mentioned, rapidly progressive glomerulonephritis because there was doubling of creatinine in 3 months. And third, because of the age, paraproteinemia also we should consider. So additional investigation we done where T3 complement level were normal, serum ANA, P-ANCA, C-ANCA, anti-GBM antibody were negative. Ultrasonography of abdomen was done, which should bilateral normal size kidney with increased echogeneity and maintained CMB. Serum protein electrophoresis was sent, and kidney biopsy was performed after 2 sessions of hemodialysis in view of marked azotemia. Serum protein electrophoresis showed M spike with M protein of 0.17 gram per deciliter in the kappa region, and serum immunofixation showed presence of monoclonal immunoglobulin IgG class with kappa light chain. And the quantitative test for IgG, IgA, and IgM with hypogammaglobulinemia. And serum free kappa light chain was 5100, and free lambda chain was 12.1, with kappa to lambda ratio was 421. Kidney biopsy, renal biopsy showed 20 glomeruli. 6 out of 20 glomeruli showed mild increase in mesangial cellularity. No crescents or organized deposits were seen. Many of the terminal tubules showed granular eosinophilic, focally laminated, pass negative, and fracture cast. Fluffing of tubular epithelium, mild tubular atrophy, interstitium showed edema, focal collection of lymphocytes and few neutrophils with mild areas of fibrosis. Vessels showed mild thickening, no evidence of vasculitis. Immunofluorescence microscopy showed that tubular cast stained 3+ for kappa light chain and negative for lambda light chain. So this is the biopsy. The arrows are pointing towards the fracture cast. The glomerulus is normal with a few RBCs are present, but it's essentially normal. Tubular is showing plenty of cast with fluffing of epithelium. Additionally, skeletal survey by X-ray, no lytic lesion. Bone marrow trifine biopsy showed moderately cellular marrow, minimal fibrosis, and increased plasma cell population up to 60 to 65% with kappa monoclonal expression of IHC. Fish fluorescent in situ hybridization analysis showed negative status for immunoglobulin heavy chain rearrangement. Both myelin and erythroid lines were reduced. The constellation of all these features and investigations are consistent with the diagnosis of kappa light chain multiple myeloma with light chain cast nephropathy. follow-up, a patient was started on steroids and bortezomib. Hemodialysis was continued for his acute kidney injury. In July 2019, he came off dialysis within 4 weeks. His serum kappa free light decreased to 562 milligram per liter. Initially, it was 5,200. And his latest serum creatinine is 1.8 milligram per deciliter. Discussion. So epistaxis is very rare presentation of multiple myeloma. It may be related to thrombocytopenia, but it was not present in our patient. Uremia, it is unlikely because epistaxis was present before the patient had uremia. Hyperviscosity versus globulins were normal. So the most likely mechanism in our patient is interference with coagulation factors. So this is the table by the Robert Kyle, who has the maximum work in myeloma and amyloidosis. So he has also mentioned that there is even he has also mentioned that not mentioned epistaxis as a manifestation at the presentation of multiple myeloma. So the spontaneous bone pain is 66%, fatigue 32%, weight loss 12%. So what is the mechanism of bleeding in our patient in this multiple myeloma? So although the qualitative platelet dysfunction is probably the most common mechanism, the pathophysiology may be multifactorial, including thrombocytopenia. So now in our patient, paraproteinemia induced qualitative platelet dysfunction can be inhibition of fibrin monomers polymerization, monoclonal thrombin inhibitor because the monoclonal itself inhibits the thrombin. The circulating heparin-like anticoagulant studies have shown that the myeloma protein itself like heparin-like anticoagulant and leads to bleeding, factor 10 deficiency, and acquired von Willebrand syndrome, and local tissue fragility secondary to amyloidosis and vascular endothelium damage. The inhibition of fibrin monomer polymerization directly by paraprotein results in a gelatinous friable clot, poor clot retraction, prolonged thrombin time, and prolonged replicase time. Thank you.
Was this patient on aspirin and clopidogrel?
No, sir.
He had angioplasty in the
Yes,
past.
sir. He was only on aspirin. He was not on any clopidogrel, sir.
So,
And did the electron microscopy show on kidney biopsy?
Sir, because the LM and IF showed a very much clear picture, we have not sent EM, sir.
Okay, LM and IM comes on 4th day. We send all 3 samples on day 1 only. If we get the adequate tissue, we also send the electron microscopy. So
I would just say again,
other lesions of kidney can be sometimes missed if you don't send electron microscopy. So they say that in all multiple myeloma, it is not the LM only immunofluorescence, but even electron microscopy should be done, if you get the third piece.
I would also say, and Dr. Bharat Shah, is that, when there are so infiltration, there is cellular cells in the interstitium. Elderly males, immunohistochemistry would really help to rule out at times if there is additional reasons for this amyloidosis, like we had in our patient. And what is it, bulbar? Your patient had bulbar palsy, you said?
Yes, sir, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. He had a bulbar palsy. It was labeled by neurologist as query Guillain-Barré query myasthenia, but it was
multiple myeloma.
Ma'am, it is
multiple myeloma without. I mean, it's not paraproteinemia.
It's not common. The peripheral neuropathy is more common, but if the myeloma cells affect the meningeal, if there is a plasmacytoma in the brain, the patient may present with these symptoms. But in our case, when he came to us, there was no any symptoms like this of hoarseness of voice, meanwhile we could investigate further for his hoarseness of a change in voice. We got this diagnosis of myeloma and we treated him for that, and all symptoms resolved. It's all symptoms resolved with the treatment of myeloma, ma'am. There was no further episodes of epistaxis. His main manifestation of epistaxis. He had recurrent episodes of epistaxis throughout his history. But he remembered these 2 main, but he thought that epistaxis was coming on and off. And he went to all the physicians, but finally, after because the creatinine raised, he was referred to a nephrologist. This collapse of vertebra was all missed during his history and during his thorough evaluation.
So epistaxis as a presenting feature of myeloma is extremely rare, and that is the main purpose of our presentation of this case. And if you see, like this patient went to several physicians, and no one would think about it, obviously, because epistaxis is such an uncommon manifestation of myeloma. So everyone thought of a local factor, like you thought of whether he was an antiplatelet agent. Then when he presented with breathlessness, one looks only at his speciality and one forgets the findings of other investigations. Like this person, how Arun noted that there was a collapse of vertebra, which was completely missed. The urinary abnormalities were completely missed.
Yeah.
Looked at only his specialty. So very often the physicians, the other point that we wanted to stress in this case was that physicians only look at their own specialty. They don't look at the case in totality. And that is where a nephrologist becomes a good intern.
So from these two cases, the moral is any elderly patient with any proteinuria, any bone disease, any change in creatinine or GFR, you must look out for monoclonal gammopathy related kidney disease, MGRS. And here on bone marrow, in the first case, you had clear-cut plasma cells, but both the cases in your patient. But in my patient, the plasma cells were only 5%. But we could get all the answer only when we did electron microscopy and free light chain assays and everything at one go, you know. We sent everything and we did the kidney biopsy with electron microscopy and everything. And the 8th day, we had all the answer with us.
It's multiple myeloma can give rise to demyelinating neuropathy. So this bulbar involvement also may be a manifestation of multiple myeloma.
It's a rare.
And I feel that steroids that he received as a part of treatment of his what they thought to be myasthenia or Guillain-Barré probably helped his myeloma itself at that stage of time.
Good case, yeah.
So like Dr. Arun Shah said that, you know, if for students, you see a proteinuria or you see an unusual presentation where you can't pinpoint and you don't have an obvious answer, keep myeloma in your mind because it can present as varied ways and you pick it up nothing like it because the patient will definitely benefit out of an early diagnosis. Otherwise, they keep roaming around with general manifestations and they don't get diagnosed. Very important.
And in 2018, there's a great classification of MGRS has come out that they should learn that any patient with borderline proteinuria, elderly man, creatinine may be normal, your plasma cells may be normal, but if you have free light chain assays which are abnormal, you must do a biopsy to find out where he stands in the disease process. And if the kidney biopsy shows any lesion, whether it is immunoglobulin related or something else, then you can still treat the patient with full dose of bortezomib, lenalidomide, and steroid. You may not have classical myeloma, you may not have classical AL amyloid, but there are a series of diseases described in MGRS. We still require treatment like myeloma only. So that's why they say that MGRS will come as a big play in myeloma and MGUS, and that will become an in-between stage, you know. So all proteinuric patients, you'll have to do a biopsy to define whether they have got MGRS or not. Suppose if somebody is MBAND, but the plasma cells are normal, still you do the biopsy, then you will be able to classify them somewhere. It's a very article recently. The whole classification has come out.
We carry on. Any other comments, questions? So let's move on towards transplants. We all transplant physicians come across very common situations around the transplant day. How do you clinically handle it? Where do you take a decision, yes or no? We are going to bring forth two cases where we came across cross-match positive situations and to see how we handle it. The first case will be shown by me and the second case Dr. Prashant Rajput will take it. So let's start with the case. This is the story of a 41-year-old male who was diagnosed to have end-stage kidney disease secondary to FSGS, and he was on maintenance dialysis for 4.5 years. He had listed himself for deceased donor transplantation and his weight was this much. He did not have any history of blood transfusions, did not have any history of transplants in the past. We have a cadaver transplant or a deceased donor transplant OPD wherein we evaluate the patients thoroughly, and every 3 months the patient comes and follow up. His last PRA class 1 and class 2 was 0. He was called in for a transplant on 11th of March 2020, this year 11th of March. So he was reasonably worked up. PRA was 0, no transfusions, no sensitization status. He was called in. Who was the donor?
Screen is not seen. Everyone can hear.
Are you sharing your screen?
We did. 1 second. Let me try
Not seen.
again.
We didn't see the
You're not sharing your screen.
Okay. No, this one. This one. Now it can be seen?
Yeah.
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 Start from
I'll
beginning.
restart. So this is the case of a 41-year-old male who is diagnosed to have end-stage kidney disease secondary to focal segmental glomerulosclerosis, and he's on maintenance dialysis for 4.5 years. At the start of dialysis, he lists himself for a cadaver transplant. He does not have any history of blood transfusion. He's doing reasonably well on dialysis. No history of previous transplants. We follow up our patients 3 monthly in our deceased donor transplant OPDs, wherein we evaluate the patients, update their data so that anytime they are called, we are reasonably worked up with the patient. So his latest panel reactive antibody class 1 and class 2 was 0. He was called in for a deceased donor transplant on 11th of March 2020. The donor was a 65-year-old male, hypertensive, had an intracranial bleed. The EGFR was 65 and the kidneys were smallish. They were 8 centimeters and there was the kidneys were planned to be distributed as single kidneys, but since most of the centers said that this was an extended criteria kidney, it was distributed as a dual kidney transplant. And this patient was on the list for the transplant, so we called him. Crossmatch was sent while the patient was being prepared. It came back positive. So we had all prepared everything. The OT was due. We were just waiting for the crossmatch and it came out to be positive. It was a Lysate DSA crossmatch which was reported to us as positive. We then spoke to the lab. We discussed the patient's case and we told them that we would like to have a detailed CDC crossmatch report. 4 hours later, we were called saying that the crossmatch report is negative and we could decide what we would want to do. We evaluated the situation. The patient was not sensitized. The patient's repeated PRAs were negative, the latest also being negative, class 1 and class 2. Less likelihood that there were HLA antibodies which were actually causing a CDC crossmatch to come positive. We discussed with the laboratory which had given us the report, and we decided to take the patient ahead. We would have done a flow crossmatch, but given that this was a deceased donor transplant situation and we did not have much time to wait, we decided to go ahead given the clinical situation. We went ahead with the transplant. Induction immunosuppression given was 3 mg per kg antithymocyte globulin and solumetrol. Maintenance immunosuppression was kept at prednisolone, TAC and MMF with the TAC level being 10 to 14. Patient was discharged with an optimal renal function with an uneventful course at day 10 post-transplant. So this is a situation I'm sure many of us are facing. So I would like to just take you through these lysates and the CDC cross match. And we all know, more for the students I'm saying this, that cross matching was developed to initially identify recipients who are likely to develop an acute vascular rejection of a graft from a given donor. This phenomenon of hyperacute rejection is a result of preformed antibodies to one or more HLA of the donor, referred to now as donor-specific antibodies. Hyperacute rejections can occur immediately upon reperfusion of the donor kidney. This catastrophic outcome necessitates the immediate removal of graft, which many of us in the previous world, when I was a student, I have seen blue kidneys. Many of us have gone through this. Clearly, avoiding a rejection in an acute situation is desirable, and cross-matching helps us predict this. Way back, we have seen this landmark paper wherein Dr. Terasaki has nicely, elegantly shown that if there is a positive cross-match, your risk of immediate graft loss is more than 80%. And a prospective cross-match, if positive, transplant should not be allowed. Some antibodies directed against the donor, but not clinically relevant, are non-HLA antibodies. So this was brought out in the paper in 1969. And imagine from 1969 to 2020, we are still grappling around a cross-match. What does a CDC cross-match do? It seeks to identify clinically significant donor-specific HLA antibody. Why clinically significant? Because we have a lot of HLA antibodies which may not activate a complement, which may not bind to the antigen. So you have to have an antibody which is going to engage an antigen and activate a complement. That is why a clinically significant donor-specific antibody from a given recipient. Lymphocytes from the donor will be isolated, separated into T and B. Serum is mixed with it. Serum is supposed to have antibodies. Donor cell is supposed to have an antigen. If there is an engagement of the antibody and the antigen, once we add a complement and we add the required institutes or required constitutes of the cross-match, there should be a lysis of the cell if there has been an engagement and there has been a reaction. Once the lysis of the cell occurs and you put a vital dye, the cell appears to be killed. And this is how a picture of a cross-match would appear under a microscope. So if the vital dye has been taken up, then you will see cell death. And the amount of cell death is what is counted in a cross-match. So that is as simple as it gets. Now, obviously, because the CDC cross-match had a lot of fallacies, all the new techniques have been developed over years. Now, if you see in a CDC cross-match, this is a small study which I would like to show that there are around 15,000 deceased donor consecutive cross-match from in over 2.5 years, where I saw that there were around 3,800 positive cross-matches and 11,000 negative cross-matches. From the 3,800 positive cross-matches, we wanted to see that how many CDC cross-matches were falsely positive and how many transplants did we deny in that situation. If you see, out of the 3,800, PRA was more than 0 in 3, 4, 5, 2. So that means these might have HLA antibodies which gave a CDC cross-match positive. Now if you see, PRA was 0 in 357 samples. So these patients were denied a transplant because they had a positive cross-match. So I label these as an unexpected positive cross-match. Why? Can we explain why the CDC came positive even if the patient did not have any HLA antibody? So the reasons which we found were that there was a 5 to 10% cell death. It was a borderline reaction, and the technician in the middle of the night thought that no, 10% to 15%, let me label it. What if the patient gets a rejection? That was minuscule. 76%, there was a high background because the cell viability was poor. So the cells, few of the cells were already dead before the cross-match happened. So those dead cells were also counted as a positive cross-match. Few of them had non-HLA antibodies and they were binding insignificantly to the cells. 96% had very highly sensitized patients on the site. See, when we call patients for cross-match and one laboratory is doing the cross-matches, what happens is that XYZ number of patients are on the same tray if you want to say. And the sensitized patients are also in one of the trays. So when you start doing the test, you may simply just fill the serum in the adjoining cell, which is very close to each other, and data entry in one. So there are multiple ways where a CDC cross-match can be given as falsely positive. Now, what about a negative cross-match? So positive can happen, but the incidence is not that much. Negative cross-match may happen more often, and what are the reasons? Situations where this might occur is where an antibody titer is too low to cause a complement activation. You have diluted the sample a lot. When the antibody is of the type that does not activate the complement only. So you have an HLA antibody, but the complement is not being activated. Like nowadays, there is more research that IgG4 type of antibodies activates complements and others don't. And when the antigen for which the antibody is specific is expressed at very low levels on the donor lymphocytes, these are the situations where a CDC can. Because there were so many nuances in the CDC, there was a need to have a different type of a cross-match which would come over all these fallacies. So in the advanced world, what has happened is that a virtual cross-match was being designed. So what is a virtual cross-match? This is what was done after the CDC cross-match was failing. So virtual cross-match refers to a comparison of the anti-HLA antibodies of the recipient as defined by Luminex or a solid phase assay, which the HLA of the donor. So you are matching the donor's HLA and you are matching the antibody profile of the recipient. If there was a donor-specific antibody present, this would present as a positive virtual cross-match. So you're not doing anything in the laboratory. You are just looking at the reports, the profiles, and you're doing a virtual match. Antibodies are defined against HLA class 1 and class 2 antigens accordingly. So this is how a virtual cross-match would happen, that you have a recipient serum. This might have antibodies against HLA. There will be beads which will be coated with antigens. All the antigens available in that population will be coated, and the beads will be numbered, that this bead has these antigens, this bead has these antigens. The antibody from the recipient, if it is present, is going to bind on the beads, and the detection is going to happen with a fluorescent dye, and there will be a dual beam lesion. So you get a printout wherein you understand what are the antibodies present in the recipient. And when you get a donor profile, you know whether there is a virtual cross-match which is positive. Now, this is an expensive technique because in this, you require an HLA of the donor, which is equally expensive. You need a HLA of the donor, you need a HLA of the recipient so that you don't miss the autoantibodies. And you also need a single antigen bead assay of the recipient, which is also very costly. So if I go to do a virtual cross-match, I will be spending somewhat around 50 to 60,000 in today's world. So what happened was that in the meanwhile, when all this was going on in the Western world, something known as a lysate cross-match came into existence, which was more driven by the demand that we need to identify DSAs, more by the peer pressure that all the world is now looking at DSAs. Literature was coming out that DSA is important. This happened around 6 to 8 years ago, when the whole literature around was showing us DSAs, how important they are, and we did not in India have any DSA test. So in Asia, this lysate cross-match was brought forth by the companies which are producing those beads, saying that in India people or in Asia people may not afford the higher range of tests, and let us find out something in between a CDC cross-match and a virtual cross-match. There came the lysate. What happens in the lysate is that you take the donor cells will have antigens on it. You match the donor cells, so you have HLA antigens, and it makes a cell lysate. So you are having a process where the cells are being matched, and then what happens is that you are incubating it with the serum of the prospective recipient for that donor. You are incubating a serum with the donor cells which are lysed and made into a lysate, thinking that on the lysate you have all the antigens which can bind to the antibody. Then you are adding a fluorescent dye and an AHG to facilitate a reaction. So if you have a reaction, you have the AHG which then binds to this combination, and then you run it through a fluorescent meter. You might either get a positive report or a negative. So this is what picked up momentum 6-7 years ago, although it was given up very long back in the Western world before the virtual crossmatch came in. Why was it given up? Thought to be cheap option, perfect for us. Initially, it was used in Europe and North America, but they found that it was very, very oversensitive and not specific, because it would get in touch with antibodies which were not pathogenic. It would also get a reaction with epitopes which were not pathogenic. So this type of cross-match has not been reported in literature. And if you go to find a literature of lysate cross-match in PubMed, you will find 2 or 3 papers. And 2 or 3 papers coming out mainly of Asia and India. This is one of those papers. So this was CMC Vellore. They tried to correlate a pre-transplant donor-specific antibody assay using a Luminex cross-match with graft outcome. So the aim of the study was to determine the clinical significance of a DSA cross-match. We call it DSA cross-match because the company labeled it as DSA, and its impact on short-term renal allograft outcomes. So if a DSA cross-match is positive, how much is it impacting the outcome of a graft? We know that CDC is very sensitive. If you have a positive CDC cross-match and you go ahead with a transplant, the outcomes are bad. You know that. Of 126 recipients, 25.4% had pre-transplant DSAs which were positive according to the DSA cross-match. Pre-transplant DSA by the Luminex with a negative CDC did not predict any adverse outcome. So they did CDC for all these patients and they did the Luminex DSA cross-match for all these patients. And they found that there was no statistical significance achieved and there was no correlation with the outcome. This was a paper by Dr. Dolly Daniel, who at a point of time was very pro Luminex cross-match and then later on has switched. This is one more paper from the same group where they presented 2 cases. Non-specific positivity of Luminex cross-match assay for anti-human leukocyte antigen antibodies due to antibodies detected against antibody-coated beads. So imagine you have beads which are coated with antibody and you have this lysate going on and your recipient serum is now reacting towards different types of proteins which are there on the beads and giving you a positive cross-match. So they are explaining 2 cases over here wherein there was a complete 100% match of HLA antigens, but the cross-match was coming positive. They realized that there was a non-specific binding of antigens and antibodies in this assay, so it can be very false positive. It was reported on the Luminex single antigen assay and they found that there was no HLA antibodies in the recipient, and it suggested that even the denatured epitopes which were used for beads, because they become denatured when you coat them, they did not affect the graft. So I have showed you what is the virtual cross-match technique. So then where are we today? We have seen that we have a patient, this is a very real situation. We, in the last minute that the kidney is already arrived, the patient has to be shifted to OT. Cross-match has come positive. Last minute we have to decide whether we take the kidney, we neglect the cross-match, what do we do? So in today's world, where do we stand? The CDC cross-match still remains viable for us. It is a functional assay, so it is very viable. It is a functional assay because you have a complement activation which is shown in the CDC. If you do the CDC cross-match in a detailed manner where you have a T cell, B cell, you are doing an allo cross-match, you are doing an auto cross-match, you are adding TT, you are breaking IgA bonds and getting it out of the way. You are doing a cross-match on previous serums, current serums. You add an AAG to enhance your sensitivity of giving you a cross-match with a plain simple CDC is going to be invaluable. After this, if at all you have a CDC which is negative or positive and you compare it with your panel reactive antibody, you can do a lot clinically with the patient. And this is how I would want to put a paradigm and more for the students to understand that if you have a CDC cross-match negative and a reliable history, you have a solid phase assay which is negative and a point or a flow negative, you are DSA negative, you will go ahead with transplant. But if you have one of these positives, say you have a CDC cross-match positive, 8G CDC is negative and the solid phase is positive, you will proceed with caution because you know that this patient has HLA antibody and you have to find out whether they are directed against the donor or no. If they are not directed against the donor, you are safe. At the same end, if you have a CDC crossmatch which is positive, you have an AHG which is positive, or flow which is positive. But if you find that your donor specific solid phase assay is negative, you might want to neglect this. So you'll have to tie, in today's world, you will have to try and tie everything together. We'll have to see what kind of test we are using. We'll have to see clinically what is the patient showing. If the patient is totally non-sensitized, persistently the PRA has been negative with a reliable test, then the CDC being positive or the other crossmatch being positive will have to be questioned and will have to be properly seen. I would end there. Any comments?
So I will tell you that the main purpose of our presenting this case is that in the early hours of morning, our patient has gone for a cross match and we get a report saying that the cross match is positive, PRA positive to class 2. How do we proceed? And normally one would say, well, if the cross match is positive, we don't want to take a chance. So when this report came to us, it was not the usual report. It said PRA cross-match positive to class 2. But if it is a CDC cross-match, then they will not report as class 2. So that is how we came to know. It was not even told to us that they are going to do a lysate cross-match. That is how we came to know that they had done a lysate cross-match. So we went ahead and we did a CDC cross-match. The CDC cross-match was negative, and that is how we went ahead with the transplant. Are you able to hear us?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yes, you well.
No, we couldn't see everything now, so we were trying to arrange the screens again.
Okay.
Now with crossmatch talk, everybody became silent, you know.
So the main purpose of our presentation is this, that we got this report in the early hours of morning that PRA class 2 is positive. This is not the standard way that we get reports. So we asked for a CDC crossmatch which was negative, and we went ahead and did the transplant, and the patient has done well without any episode of rejection. So this is one more case which shows the limitations of CDC crossmatch. I'm sorry, limitations of lysate crossmatch.
Shruti, very nice presentation. But how current should your single antigen lead be? Means to interpret.
How often?
How current should your single antigen lead? For the antibody levels.
Question.
Yes.
Obviously, the most recent, the better.
So we are doing it at least 3 to 6 monthly for a deceased donor. 3 months becomes too much because it is very costly. So I would say once in a year for our population should be okay. And if they have had a blood transfusion, of course, we should take a serum before the transplant so that we are wiser if any event occurs.
But it is always a good idea that when you register a patient for deceased donor transplant, we do PRA before they are registered. We are now introducing extra points for those who are PRA positive, and we are going to very soon have a meeting and get this introduced. So far, this was not being regularly implemented, but if your PRA is positive, then you can go higher up on the list, and it is a good idea to do it before you register for deceased donor transplant. How to check PRA? Maybe once in 6 months would be a good idea to keep checking for PRA. They don't cost much. It costs about 5,000 to 6,000 rupees. And if you request Dr. Rasika, it said it can be done at times without any cost.
I think we'll request Shruti.
Yes, sir. If it is in my hands, yes, I will do it.
Okay, Bharat, been outvoted. Shruti is going to ensure that we get a concession.
So the international recommendations say 6 monthly, but in our situation in India, practically what I have seen and done in the last few years is that once a year I try to get it because I'm using up the funds of the patient. So, and a screening test is always available, which as sir says is 5,000 to 6,000 rupees. But if we go to do a percentage PRA, which is what our ZTCC marketing is including, that is a little costlier. So we have to, once we have a lab which is giving it to us in a subsidized rate, it might be better to do it 6 months. Is what I'm saying.
Yeah, but now we don't do panel reactive. We do this by single antigen bead. No?
But you might not go directly for single antigen. See, if someone is not sensitized and the PRA is 0, there is no sense in identifying antibodies which are not there. So if there is an intermediate screen which is giving you a PRA percentage and it is less than 5% or 0%, single antigen bead becomes very costly for that person.
Now, but we are doing screening with class 1 and class 2.
That is not single antigen.
That is not single antigen. That is just screening.
Screening. But they have a test known as PRA percentage. So the screening is a very basic test where they have some 6 beads. But the intermediate screen will have some 100 beads where all the population antigens will be aggregated and will give you a little better sensitivity than the screen. So we have been pursuing the percentage PRA for the last few times because it's a little better in managing the patient. Because sometimes we have rejections and the PRA comes 0 and there's an ABMR on the biopsy. So then that intermediate PRA percentage comes to help. Should we move ahead?
No, I'm
Yep.
some comments. Any comments? I'm sure you all must have faced this situation of CDC cross-match negative, Lysate cross-match positive, what to do further. I've seen this happen not uncommonly. And that is the main reason why we brought up this case.
You can go ahead.
Go ahead with the next case.
Yeah.
So next is the second in the series in transplant. So Dr. Prashant Rajput will present that interesting case in transplant. Prashant, go ahead.
Yeah. Are you able to hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I'll just share my screen. Yeah, good afternoon, friends and teachers. I'm presenting this interesting case. Screen is visible?
No.
No.
So share this link.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can see the road.
Yeah, that's a beautiful road.
Thanking us before.
So this is a very interesting case which we had encountered, and this would increase the curiousness of the cross match. So it's a curious case of a cross match. This is a patient who was 55 years old, male, blood group was B positive. His primary disease was polycystic kidney disease and polycystic liver disease. In 2003 as well as 2004, he had 2 surgeries done for laparoscopic cyst deroofing of his liver cyst. So his liver was massively enlarged. In 2003, again, he had a mesh hernioplasty. And this was a time where they found that he had chronic kidney disease and during this mesh plasty. And eventually by 2007, he ended up with an end-stage kidney disease. So this was a time where he was suggested a kidney transplant, and he underwent a kidney transplant in 2007, where his wife was the donor. He was an ABO compatible pair. He had a NEFT and nephrectomy done prior to his transplant, and because of the increased size of the liver, they thought that they would do a left iliac fossa transplantation for him. He was on triple immunosuppression, TAC, MMF, and steroids. And his best creatinine post the surgery was 0.9 milligrams per deciliter. And we did not find any detail of induction because this transplant was done at another center. But the patient said an expensive medicine was used. So definitely he had an induction agent which was used at that time since it was a spousal transplant. His liver disease was quite significant. He had an abdominal discomfort which started in about 2011. And ultrasound done at this time showed that he had minimal ascites with a huge liver, about 30 centimeters, 35 centimeters length and breadth of the liver. And over the period of time in 2013, his ascites had come up, and he had signs of portal hypertension. So he had a massive ascites which went on. His creatinine started rising. His ascites became difficult to manage. And by 2017, he was admitted with us for the ascitic tapping. This was the first time where he took a hepatology consult, and he was under treatment of the hepatology and the HBP surgery team at our hospital. Yeah, his ascitic tapping was done when he got admitted. He had no SBP at that time. His creatinine came out to be 2.4 milligrams per deciliter, and his creatinine clearance at this time was about 30 mils per minute. His assessment was done for his allograft dysfunction, and we came to a conclusion that probably his chronic allograft dysfunction is a part of HRS CKD. A biopsy was also done earlier, which did not show any rejection. So we thought it was an HRS CKD. And he was registered because he still did not fall under criteria for combined SLKT. So he was registered only for a liver transplant in the initial part. At 2018, he had refractory ascites. He had multiple admissions for ascitic tapping. He was treated multiple times with albumin terlipressin, which was infused even at his home. And over a period of time, his creatinine started rising. At the end of 2018, his creatinine was about 4.8, and eventually we had to plan his access. This was a time when he was planned and registered for a simultaneous kidney liver transplant. And he was managed conservatively till he progressed, and eventually he was initiated on maintenance dialysis. During his course of registration, his recipient evaluation was done, and his liver was quite concerning because it was about 40-45 centimeters that time in length and breadth, and his kidney size, the right kidney, was about 16 centimeters. He's, as Shruti also said, that we do PRA for all patients who are undergoing transplant. So he was positive for class 1 and class 2 understanding because probably he must have developed some anti-HLA antibodies. His cardiology, since he was non-diabetic, his cardiology clearance was okay. He also underwent a complete urology and anesthesia clearance, and eventually he was planned for an SLKT. About 4 months or 5 months on dialysis, he got a call where he had a suitable donor, which was about 60 years old at our hospital. His MELD at this time was 17, his CTP was about 7B, and because he had to receive SLKT, a cross-match test was asked. And this cross-match test, which was a CDC cross-match, by the way, it was not a lysate assay, and the CDC cross-match was strongly positive for both class for T and B cell cross-match. So there was a question whether we should go ahead, considering that he had a positive PRA as well as a positive cross-match, and whether he would have a high chance of antibody mediated rejection, mainly the hyperacute rejection. And but our liver team felt that, they felt that we should go ahead and do the transplant. Or there was a question that we just hold it. We discussed, we did a lot of literature search, and we came to a conclusion that this patient who's going for a simultaneous liver kidney transplant with a very high cross match, positive cross match. And what we learned from this case was the liver allograft actually exerts an immunoprotective effect against this antibody mediated injury to the kidney. When these anti-HLA antibodies present enough to produce a positive cross-match. Hyperacute rejection actually has not been observed in SLKT transplants, and uh, till date, this protective effect due to the anti-HLA antibody is because of absorption of this antibody, and it has been seen that the antibody titers reduce or they disappear after the liver transplantation, and you can then safely do a kidney transplant. So this was quite surprising because the data with highly sensitized patients are so scanty, and they're just based on a few reports where an SLKT in a situation of a positive cross match has had successful outcomes. There were some studies which looked at sensitized patients and compared them with non-sensitized recipients, and they found that these patients had no difference in the incidence of antibody-mediated rejection, and they had no significant impact on the patient and graft survival at 1 year. So this became a point for us to start. And there was another study which looked at that the sheer mass of the liver, what you gave, the liver is about 1.5 kilos, and the and it has a very high um, uh, tendency of absorbing the antibody, and the combined organ effect we saw that's and the combined organ effect and the protection which it causes against rejection, and that is found because it is because of the increase in the antigen load, and this was possibly thought. But there was this interesting paper which came about, and this was a successful combined partial auxiliary liver and a kidney transplantation in highly sensitized cross-match positive recipients. So this was in 2006, and it was one of its kind, the first time reported in literature, where patients who were highly sensitized underwent who were positive cross-match, CDC cross-match. That means they had a significant amount of anti-HLA antibodies which were directed against that particular donor. And when it was combined with a partial auxiliary liver transplant from the same donor, it actually prevented the rejection. There were 7 patients in this paper. And what they did was they looked at the cross match after the auxiliary liver transplantation. And to their surprise, what they found was there was a significant reduction in the titers of the antibodies, or the antibodies disappeared, or the cross match became negative, and then they did a kidney transplant with successful outcomes. So transplant, what we did was we did the transplant in this patient. We used methylprednisolone and basiliximab as an induction agent. We started the triple drug immunosuppression TAC and MMF at lower doses, obviously, of TAC. Valganciclovir and Septran was started on day 5. Pre-op antibiotics given was piperacillin, tazobactam, and cefazolin, because there's a lot of handling. The operative time in a liver transplant is also quite high. The total day stays of this patient was about 18 days, and the patient was discharged with a creatinine of 1.1. So this patient did not have any acute antibody-mediated rejection. The cold ischemia time was about 244 minutes, and the warm ischemia was 44 minutes. The IVC clamping time was 57 minutes. No significant transfusion for this patient. He just received 2 transfusions. His anastomosis was done to the both external and internal iliac arteries, both end to side. A DJ stent was placed. His peak lactate levels during the surgery was about 7.5, and post the surgery was about 5.8, which also told us that the liver was doing its job. And the patient had no immediate output. This was the explanted liver. So it was about 40 centimeters, and it weighed about 14 kilos. The patient immediately with the ascites, he lost about 24 or 25 kilos immediately after the surgery. So this was an explanted liver, which was about 14 kilos. His post-op course, he was ventilated for the day. We had initiated TAC at 1 milligrams twice a day, mycophenolate at the standard doses of 360 milligrams twice a day, and he had a urine output and substantial urine output after furosemide, which was about 1500 mils. On day 2, he became extubated. His creatinine reduced to 3.6. Doppler was normal. On day 11, his creatinine was 1.1. His TAC were low. The doses were adjusted now because his liver had picked up. His bilirubin had become normal. his PTINR was normal, and his albumin was gradually improving, and he was discharged eventually at creatinine of 1.1. So there are so many learning points in this case. The most important learning point is when you do an SLKT, it protects from the harmful anti-HLA antibodies. The liver has a tremendous capacity to absorb the anti-HLA antibodies, which are directed against this particular donor, and the donor liver absorbs the antibodies. And it has been seen that after 1 hour of liver transplant, 1 hour post the liver transplant, which we usually take time to make the bed, most of the antibodies have disappeared from the system. And even if they have not disappeared, the titers of the antibodies have significantly come down, not enough to produce an acute antibody mediated rejection or a hyperacute rejection. A positive cross match in a setting of SLKT can undergo a transplant from the same donor. It has to be the same donor, which is very important. In a setting of a highly sensitized recipient, an orthotropic liver transplantation from the same donor is an option. So those patients who are extremely sensitized, where you have a very, very high difficulty in getting them a suitable pair, or you have difficulty in desensitizing patients, an orthotropic auxiliary liver transplant remains an option. And there have been cases where they have used eculizumab, rituximab, and done an auxiliary liver in a case which had an unrecordable amount of DSAs to a particular donor, and they had a successful outcome with a good patient and graft survival of that particular case. The patient survived for more than 5 years. One important thing is there have been cases of vanishing bile duct syndrome, which have been reported when you do an ABO incompatible transplant in sensitized recipients. So this is the very brief of the case which we encountered, and there were so many learning points. Thank you for this patient listening, and if you have questions, we will definitely be very happy to answer. And we need to enjoy the monsoon rains today.
What is the mechanism by which liver absorbs the antibodies?
Sir, liver, the Kupffer cells, they are the cells which produce they are the cells which take care of the antibodies. And once you have a donor with that particular HLA, it absorbs these antibodies, and it metabolizes the antibodies within a very, very short period of time. So it doesn't allow its own self to be killed. So it absorbs them and it neutralizes them.
That is the same donor should be there for
same
liver
donor.
also.
You can't have a different donor for the kidney and different donor for the liver. Then you don't exert that protective effect. So this can be done.
So the native kidney the same thing.
Yes, sir.
The native kidney cannot do the same. The native kidney cannot do the same thing.
Only the Kupffer cells in
native
the liver.
liver.
Only the Kupffer cells in the liver. These are the cells which are important for recycling of antibodies.
The native liver cannot do the same thing.
No, it can't do it. No, because it is not. You need to have that HLA specificity.
Same HLA.
Yeah.
Secondly, Prashant, the choice of your induction, with basilizumab versus ATG in a highly sensitized patient.
In a liver transplant, madam, we don't use ATG because ATG has adverse, very poor outcomes in liver transplant.
So it's never used.
No, never used.
Causes a lot of thrombosis in the liver graft, so the liver transplant do not usually get thymocyte globulin.
Prashant, stop sharing the screen.
Okay, sure.
Where is this picture from, Prashant?
Prashant's farm.
Sir,
Prashant's farm.
Road to his farm.
Yeah, it is road to my farm.
Prashant, we have to go. Huh? You have promised this year.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Next MNG meet.
We'll keep it.
December get together.
So this was a very interesting case where one would be worried about a positive CDC cross match. And it was a learning for us from the liver team. The liver team, if you are not aware, they do not do any cross match before their transplant. So for them, it doesn't matter whether it is a positive or negative cross match. So we were on a very tight rope when we took up the patient for transplant, but it really worked out well. And post-transplant, His cross match, am I right, Prashant? His
Yes,
cross
sir.
match was repeated and it is
It is
negative.
negative cross match.
It is negative. So it goes on to show how liver can neutralize the donor-specific antibody.
Within what period it became negative?
We did the next day, sir. Next day.
Next day.
Yeah,
Very,
because yeah.
very good cases.
No, it is a
Okay.
very good learning case for us.
Yes.
Also.
Yes, for us also. Shruti, you'll have to take class for your CDCs and lycée and
Sir, we can have a series.
Immunology.
देखो
MSc series, immunology series, sir.
सर दर्द हो गया
And should we proceed to the last case of the evening?
बोन मास चलो
So we all know that all our patients are usually on polypharmacy, and when we see a patient's list, it's the full page is full. Many a times you have to turn the page over and write, and we often wonder what we should remove and what we should keep. All of us, when we see our patients, we today present, Dr. Bharat Shah is going to present an interesting case where he saw a patient of chronic kidney disease who had multiple metabolic abnormalities, and he had to untangle everything to try and see what was causing those abnormalities. So over to Dr. Bharat.
सोशल डिस्टेंसिंग नहीं प्रैक्टिस हो रहा है उधर
हो रहा है
No, you are like little less.
little less हो रहा है.
Mask is there.
Mask is there.
Okay. This is about a doctor, and the doctor very often would want to take extra precaution, and in the process, the doctor also with the treating doctor will end up taking many medicines. So this is a 65 years old doctor who was first seen by us in February 2018. And he presented with a history of hypertension for 30 years and diabetes for 12 years. But he was controlling his blood pressure and blood sugar very well. His urine was normal, his CBC was unremarkable, his creatinine was 1, his electrolytes were normal, and his ultrasound was normal. So he was doing well. His medications when he saw us at that time were a small dose of Thyronome, Nebicard and Telmisartan for his blood pressure, allopurinol, atorvastatin, metformin and linagliptin. Then I'm sure he must have been keeping well, but he came to us in March 2020 for rise in creatinine to 1.4 milligram per deciliter. So if you remember, in 2018 it was 1, and now it was 1.4, and he was quite concerned. And then with these eGFR values that you get, a 65-year-old person obviously would get scared with subsequent drop in his GFR. His urine, CBC, renal profile, except for the creatinine of 1.4 and liver profile were unremarkable. As I said before, he kept his sugars well controlled. His HbA1c was 5.5, his creatinine was 1.2. And on ultrasound, the kidneys were normal. And on Doppler, there was no evidence of renal artery stenosis. So when he came, his medications included Thyronome, Nebicard, he was on Telmisartan, he was on Clothalidone, he was on allopurinol, atorvastatin, lipospirin, metformin, linagliptin. Now with the studies coming that SGLT2 inhibitors provide cardiac and renal protection, he was on empagliflozin, he was on sodium bicarbonate, he was on a probiotic, he was on coenzyme Q as an antioxidant, and I think he was also on omega-3 fatty acids. So he was on a long list of medications. So we advised him to stop everything. All that he had was diabetes, hypertension. I was not even convinced about his hypothyroidism. So we put him on Navicard, which continued and changed from telmisartan to cilnidipine, reduced his atorvastatin from 20 to 10 milligrams, and with his well-controlled blood sugar, he was kept only on a gliptin, 5 milligrams once a day. This was in March 2020, and then there was a lockdown and we didn't have a follow-up very soon. So this was his report when we saw him in March of 2020. His creatinine, as I said, was 1.4, and on 2 grams of sodium bicarbonate, his bicarbonate was 22, which means his bicarbonate must have been lower, and therefore he must have been put on this sodium bicarbonate. So this is where we have a patient who had slightly elevated creatinine and who possibly had mild acidosis. So he repeated the tests and he sent me the reports after 4 months, and he said his hemoglobin is fine, his creatinine has come down very well. In fact, he had repeated his creatinine earlier also, and he was happy that his medicines had substantially reduced and his creatinine had improved. His bicarbonate had actually improved after stopping his sodium bicarbonate, and his electrolytes were normal. So this is the improvement in his creatinine. This is the improvement in his bicarbonate, and he is on no sodium bicarbonate. So he sent me the list what he is taking. I had forgotten what he was taking. So he said, currently I am on linagliptin, nebivolol, cilnidipine, and atorvastatin. And he reminded me that he discontinued telmisartan, xyluric, sodium bicarbonate, ecospirin, multiple supplements, empagliflozin, and chlorothalidone. So this is an example which I thought was of type 4 renal tubular acidosis, and I think it was possibly because of telmisartan that he was taking. So what do ACE inhibitors and angiotensin receptor blockers do? This is for the benefit of the fellows, that they will reduce the aldosterone production. And the role of aldosterone is to act at the collecting tubule level to reabsorb sodium, which we all know from MBBS days. And in its place, in its exchange, potassium and hydrogen are secreted. So if your sodium reabsorption stops, your potassium secretion does not happen, so you develop hyperkalemia, and your hydrogen secretion does not happen, so you develop acidosis. So you have a hyperkalemic acidosis. But there is one more pathogenetic mechanism which adds to the acidosis, that hyperkalemia will decrease ammonia-genesis, which has an important role to play in titrating hydrogen ions in the collecting tubule. This hyperkalemia will decrease ammonia-genesis in the proximal tubule. Ammonia is produced in the proximal tubule from amino acid glutamine. This ammonia is converted to ammonium by intracellular hydrogen ion and is then secreted into the proximal tubule. It then travels to the loop of Henle, and in the thick ascending limb of loop of Henle, it is transported into the interstitium, where it again breaks into hydrogen and ammonium. This ammonium then enters the collecting duct, where it is available to buffer the secreted hydrogen ion and become ammonium chloride, which is trapped in the lumen and excreted as a chloride salt. So this is what happens when you have hypoaldosteronism, and that is how one develops hyperkalemic type 4 renal tubular acidosis. So by just stopping his medicines, not only his biochemistry improved, but his number of medicines substantially reduced. So this reminds us of Sir William Osler. He has made several nice quotations during, he made a great contribution to medicine. And he says, one of the first duties of the physician is to educate the masses not to take medicine. And that is very important in today's time. We find patients coming to us with a long list of prescriptions, and almost 70% of the medicines are not required. If you are a diabetic, you need only anti-diabetic. If you are diabetic and hypertensive, all that you need is anti-diabetic and anti-hypertensive, and you don't need a battery of medications like Xyluric or Febuxostat and supplements like probiotic and antioxidants like CoQ. And some people, when they see a little rise in creatinine, today add keto analogs and so on, which is all unnecessary. The person who takes medicines must take treatment twice. And he needs that treatment twice, once from the disease he needs to recover, and then he needs to recover from the unnecessary medicine that he's taking. So just to show that we doctors and doctors themselves overtreat our patients with too many unnecessary medicines. Thank you.
What was the 9 gap?
What was the
9 gap?
So I gave you 2 reports that I have. And when he came to me in March, you saw that his bicarbonate was 22. You can calculate it. The anion gap by that time was normal. And anion gap would have been normal even otherwise with type 4 RTA.
Yeah, it is normal with type 4 RTA.
Yeah,
I was just wondering whether it's a bit on the higher side. Depends how you calculate the anion gap there.
Right. No, we calculate with sodium only, not potassium.
I've had two patients with SGLT2 inhibitors, and the moment they started taking, after that 2 years, progressively rise was not noticed. And once the patient came to me, I stopped the SGLT2 and the creatinine started settling.
So I think in the doctor that I presented, there were 3 possible factors for rise in creatinine. One is SGLT2 inhibitor, the other is chlorthalidone that he was taking, and third thing is telmisartan that he was taking.
So, but these are the recommended drugs for control of blood pressure, diabetic proteinuria. What do you do if patient has proteinuria?
Caution.
So if a patient has proteinuria, one would use an ACE inhibitor or angiotensin receptor blocker. But this doctor had a very well controlled blood sugar for all this period. He had very well controlled hypertension. He had proteinuria in the normal range. He even did not have microalbuminuria. So there was no real indication for him to be on angiotensin receptor blocker. I would still use it if it is not affecting the kidney function in small dose. Not be very aggressive. In elderly people, one doesn't need to be very aggressive in blood pressure control.
Yeah, good lesson. Yeah.
Diabetes itself is a known cause of type 4 RTA.
Correct. Yeah.
Diabetes with mild renal insufficiency is a cause. But I thought that this case was also as interesting as the case presented by Prashant of doing transplant despite cross-match being positive.
Yes.
It's not only transplant that makes it interesting, even our regular cases, there is a lot to learn.
Transplant will leave it to Shruti, break your head.
No, it's no breaking head. I think we, if we look at our routine cases and if we just try and analyze them, we have a lot to learn from our routine cases.
Yeah, yes. So many times you just reduce number of drugs and patient settles down, you know. I agree with you.
Bharat, did you do the aldosterone level?
I did not do it because I could see what the problem is. This doctor was really worried, and I thought he may not follow my treatment, but he did follow it. I was a little skeptic because he sounded very apprehensive himself, but he did follow it, and he was.
When was empagliflozin started in?
When was it started?
Yeah.
I think it must have been started a few months before he came to me. Because that is the time when all reports started coming of SGLT2 inhibitors having a cardio and genoprotective effect.
Credence.
Yeah.
Now even beyond credence, and it's not just even in DAPA CKD is coming out wherein you're using it even in non-diabetics.
I know, but I think people have to understand where it is to be rightly applied. It cannot be just blindly applied to every diabetic. That is one thing that one must try and understand. That what you read in the article is not applicable to everyone with diabetes and high blood pressure. You have to select out the cases.
I think like ours, they'll give nephrologists a lot of patients. Ours and ACs like.
Shruti, where are the snacks?
Next,
Virtual snacks.
Vicky is going to deliver it to your doorstep.
Okay. Garma garam, I hope.
Samosas and sandwiches.
Weather is correct. Sir.
Weather is right for
इतना बोल रहे हो, इतना
garam
बारिश
chai or bhujia.
समोसे और सैंडविच.
Hot tea with samosa.
Pakoda.
And for Prashant's farmhouse.
A very healthy life for the last 4 months. No outside food, only home food, dal, chawal, roti, sabzi. What we tell our
I don't
patients.
know if Bharat remembers when it used to rain in this fashion at KEM, from Sayadri used to buy about 60 banana vadas and make tea in the pantry and have a good garam chai or banana vade.
Wow.
So when we were at Hinduja, me and Mukesh used to go to the tapri on the seaside. वो एकदम सी अंदर है ना, उधर खड़े रह के मुकेश बटर मार के सैंडविच खाता था. बारिश हो रही है, गरम गरम चाय और सैंडविच.
Anyhow, good meeting. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Bharat.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think the chemicals wants to give a vote of thanks.
Good cases, Shruti, Dr. Shah.
Yeah, it's all a collective effort.
Next month we are having West Zone, and in October we will be having at Bombay Hospital, and we will be having a meeting in honor of Dr. Vidyacharya, which we were supposed to have in May.
Reminder for abstracts for ISN West Zone, 15th August is the extension of the date. Registrations have been opened. I have sent across the link. I will send it across to Dr. Sirsat and Dr. Kalpana to put it on our group too. So
I have not got my receipt.
We'll send it to you, sir.
Ah, electronic which have to come back immediately.
No, they are the back end. The vendor end is doing all the web page work. So the registrations are going to them, but I will tell them that we should give an acknowledgement at least.
But it will be a good virtual meeting. I don't know why ISN did not agree to do it, but it would have been worthwhile.
ISN is not doing a virtual?
They are not wanting to do virtual meetings.
They are not doing it at all?
Yeah, they are not doing it at all.
They should do it. No, this breakup is good, what you have planned.
Platform only.
That breakup is
That's
good.
it,
That
hopefully,
doing on 4 days.
Hopefully, if we have a good virtual ISN based on that, it would be an example for them.
Achha. That must be the local organizing committee. Where were we supposed to have the national body?
We were going to have it in Chennai, but because of the surge in cases, they didn't want to hold it.
No, but the virtual They
No, no. So virtual today will help. No, no, they refuse to hold physical meeting. So I did
that
say
is fine.
I did
And
say
I don't think you're going to get.
how will try.
Okay, जाओ बात देखना है.
Ashok, you're online.
So we can hear you.
Hello.
Yeah, go ahead, Ashok.
Sorry, we're battling the water. My house is flooded. So we are in a bad mess. We are a terrace flat.
Ah.
Terrible flat.
It's
I
really
don't know
bad.
the-
Going a
No.
lot.
My house is
Even I had to.
110 kilometers they say it will go to today. It's ridiculous. I've never seen so bad. I've not been able to attend. I'm sorry because we had to just we're bailing out water from the house. Can you believe it? There was a terrace flat.
Yeah.
Can't help.
How come Siddharth's name is displayed for you, Ashok?
You don't approve this, no? You said never. I'm using his computer, so I'm just kidding. We use his computer, which is the best. He has the best computer.
Okay.
October.
Bhupendra.
Yeah.
अकेला चाय पी रहा है उधर. नाश्ता.
I'm waiting for a batata vada to come from KEM hospital.
हाँ, जो बराबर है. You did not realize that you were caught in
See, this
action.
is the thing about what happened is this is a big virtual meeting. We got so much attendance, in spite of so much rain outside, and Queen's Road is flooded. Believe me, there is a 1 foot water on Queen's Road today, right now.
अच्छा.
It's
Yes.
terrible. Believe me. I think what Ashok is saying is right. Absolutely, it's terrible over here. 2 trees have fallen down near our house, and things are really bad in South Mumbai. I don't know. People say it's less in Nanded and other places, but really bad.
Dadar, there's a lot of rain and winds.
The wind is terrible. What Hemal says is windows are rattling, you know, believe me, really, windows will, and you see the Just Look, this thing, have you seen that thing?
No.
I put it on the MNG or Nepro or you know, because some of the panels that come down to Just Look hospital, believe me.
Oh.
It's really terrible.
Boy.
I think it's really bad today, you know, it's unbelievable.
And they got high tide must be going down now.
The high tide must be gone down by 1:30 today, 1:32 o'clock, you know.
Yeah.
But the wind, the force of the
South Bombay is
unbelievable.
It's raining also in the catchment areas. So that will be good
This is the
news for
catchment area.
the water. Yeah.
In a mess, total mess.
Chalo.
Okay.
Chalo.
I'm sending the Just Look pictures to you people in the Nepro or you go for, okay? See how
Okay.
it's really bad in Bombay.
Send the pictures.
Comment, Mr. Milan.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you for a wonderful session, and I thank all the speaker for a wonderful presentation. We would like to have future such opportunity from Mumbai Nephrology Group, and as you said, there is a West Zone meeting is also planned up. Do consider us for such platforms. We are always.
You take care of it.
Yeah, we'll always be there, sir.
Virtual meeting. It's only a virtual meeting.
So Milan will fulfill your wishes.
Yeah. Definitely. We are there, sir. We are there for you. Thank you. With your permission, I'm ending this meeting. Right, sir?
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.